In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at how humans have adapted culturally to some of the climate types that we have studied in previous lectures. For our purposes here, we are modifying our initial definition of what an ecosystem is to engage the concept of a human ecosystem. So a human ecosystem, in this case, is going to be defined as that cycle of matter and energy that includes all living organisms and their interrelationship to the local natural environment. However, what we are doing here is we're taking a look through the lens of how humans have adapted to a specific landscape. Here, the concept of efficiency becomes very important. We look at how human culture helps individuals to be able to mine out of the local landscape the type of energy, the amount of energy that they need to survive as a community. In terms of the work of biogeographers, this means that concepts like diet become extremely important, especially when you're dealing with populations or communities of foragers or small-scale agriculturalists. Their connection to the land is very different from an industrial or a post-industrial society. So when we step back and look at what a human ecosystem is, it becomes a predictable system in which we engage the idea of energy extraction and energy usage. We'll begin our look at human ecosystems by starting in the north, specifically in a polar climatic environment. So this would be group E. And we will focus on the subregion of tundra, capital E, capital T. Now, in terms of tundra, again, just to review, the location of tundra environments or the geography of tundra climates generally will be found on the fringes of places like the Arctic Ocean or in small coastal areas in places like Antarctica. In terms of how this kind of climate is experienced, we're dealing with temperatures that are generally cold. So we will have long, cold, and dark winters. We will see brief, cool summers, but again, it will be an extreme kind of experience. In terms of the controls to this climate, there are going to be very few um, atmospheric controls. Most of the controls relate to location, in this case, latitude, the distance that these land masses and coastal regions are in terms of their relationship to the equator and how the Sun-Earth relationship is a big part of that region. The name tundra really relates to the low ground-hugging kind of vegetation that exists in high latitude environments, both in the north and in the south. It also is generally assigned to areas that are considered high in terms of their altitude. Given this extreme nature, Inuit speakers, and the term Inuit relates to a language community. It's a community that stretches across most of the northern hemisphere, and it is again associated with areas that are classified as part of the tundra group. Inuit residents generally, and in terms of their demographics, will be limited. Their community sizes will be generally small. And again, the nature of the environment, the landscape in which Inuit speakers live, will be a big part of this demographic control. So from October to July, waters in areas that we find Inuit speakers living will be generally locked in ice. During this period, animals, with the exception of seals and walruses, will generally be in a process of migration. They'll migrate to the south. And again, this ecosystem is very much affected by the Sun-Earth relationship and where the Earth is in its orbit around the Sun. So by midwinter, for example, the ice is reaching its thickest expression and the nights are very, very long. The Inuit people are hunters and gatherers, or they are foragers. They are not domesticating and raising crops in this kind of environment. They live in a harsh environment. So hunting or the hunting of animal resources represents a kind of core element to their overall community-wide diet. In late July, temperatures rise above freezing, and we start to see Inuit environments incorporate more of the hunted materials. They will also incorporate some vegetative material in this kind of cool summer environment. Grasses and shrubbery will produce different kinds of berry resources. Then, of course, the plants themselves become a kind of resource, not only for the humans, but also many of the animals that they are hunting as part of their subsistence strategy. As I said earlier, these Arctic extremes really limit the size of Inuit communities. We do not see communities, at least prior to European contact, being anywhere more than 80 to 100 individuals. The environment, the local environment, and this style of subsistence cannot support populations that are any larger than that. Also, in terms of prehistoric and then early historic um, studies of these regions, we find that there were practices that were designed to limit the size of populations. This included infanticide in its most, again, extreme expression of this kind of population control. But there were other methods as well, including some marriage practices. So family planning, ironically, is something that is again, important to this particular region, at least in terms of a pre-contact or early contact period. However, what we have seen since modern contact in northern and extreme southern portions of our planet and its latitudes, we have started to see increases in population sizes, averaging in this case approximately 3% annually since the late 19th century. Also, one of the other changes that we have seen to affect population sizes in some of these more extreme climates is the introduction of modern hunting techniques and the presence of food storage technologies and other Western labor practices. So, historic and modern analyses by biogeographers of life in extreme climates, such as our Arctic region, specifically the tundra subregion of that, include a variety of factors, and there's five I want to share with you. Many of the studies will take a look at, of course, subsistence practices over seasonal cycles and how those have changed over time. A second factor that many of these analyses will incorporate will be the kinds of natural fuels that are being utilized. A third, the amount of physical labor that is involved in some of the food and resource procurement practices. A fourth, the presence of wage labor and the impact that that had on Inuit life. And then fifth and finally, the presence of store-bought foods and some of these long-term storage technologies and how these have impacted the diet. In terms of findings, when we take a look at an average modern Inuit community, they will generally expend, again annually, about 12 million kilocalories of energy as a group. Hunting, mining, carving, working for wages, maintaining households, traveling, visiting other groups, things like that. On average, an Inuit community will consume over 800 gallons of gasoline, 600 gallons of kerosene, and well over 10,000 rounds of ammunition in terms of some of these modern hunting practices. In terms of what they collect, the average Inuit community today living in these more frigid environments will collect a little over 13 million kilocalories of food. 7.5 million kilocalories of food will actually be consumed by some of their beasts of burden. In this case, dogs are very, very common in this region. And then they are supplementing their diets generally in the modern sense with over 7 to 8 million kilocalories of store purchased foods, and many of these foods are purchased in bulk. So again, we're kind of comparing, the amount of energy that a community will um, give in order to survive and what they will receive in terms of the fruits of that labor. And it's this relationship that biogeographers will use to assess how human populations, whether it's in the prehistoric past or the early historic record, or even in our modern history today, how they have adapted to these environments and how efficiently they have adapted. Biogeographers will break this down even further, looking at some of the important details in the Inuit diet. They have found that the Inuit diet, even today, incorporates quite a bit of game, primarily seal, whale, and caribou. They have also recognized that over time, over the last 50 to 70 years, uh, quite a bit of seal hunting has been given up, or the amount of seal in the diet has been reduced, especially in the winter months. In the spring, the caribou has historically been a large percentage of the diet of these populations. This has also increased as Western foods have been increasingly introduced to the diet of people living in these tundra environments. Studies have also found that technologies such as snowmobile technologies have made a large uh, difference in this area, or they have made a significant impact on the communities and how they are surviving in these extreme weather environments. Snowmobile technology, for example, has allowed Inuit speakers to expand their catchment area. And when I say catchment, what I mean by that is it's really the amount of geographic space that's required to meet the daily subsistence needs of a household or a community. So the snowmobile technologies have allowed them to increase this geographic space and ultimately feed more individuals from any of these collected resources. So in this case, today, estimates for Inuit communities throughout the kind of tundra subregions uh, identifies the utilization of approximately 4,500 square acres of space for a single community. So they've been able to, in a sense, estimate a ratio of space to the size of populations that that space and the collected resources within that space can ultimately support. If we are to juxtapose our look at how Inuit populations have adapted to their environment, uh, to, in this case, populations practicing a very similar kind of subsistence strategy, living in an arid environment, we can see some additional nuances to how humans are able to adapt again to varying climate types. If we turn our attention to the northwestern border of modern Botswana and portions of southern, south central, and southwestern Africa, we see a subtype of arid climate, in this case a tropical or subtropical steppe climate. As I mentioned in our last lecture, these steppe climate environments, and especially those that are associated with an arid group or the group B, are separating deserts from more humid climate types. In the case of the Kalahari Desert, or the Kalahari region, as it is sometimes called, this separation is better explained by looking at it as a separation between true desert and African savanna or tropical savanna. Historically, anthropologists recognize this area to have been sparsely occupied by pocketed extended families and small communities. Again, the harsh, arid nature of this environment and the limited access that people have to year-round foraged foods has significantly impacted the size of communities. Human communities living in and around the Kalahari Desert have been limited in terms of their overall size. Unlike populations living in the Arctic tundra, Infanticide is not common among populations historically, and we would assume prehistorically, within the Kalahari region. Other birth control methods, such as extended periods of breastfeeding, are found in many of the traditions in this region. So, correspondingly, one of the aspects of family life that we see in the Kalahari, even after contact and even within our industrial age, is to have greater spacing between births. With regard to how people live in this arid environment, most occupants live in the transition between a desert region and the semi-arid savanna lands along its borders, where we see some small stands of trees and grasslands, and of course we see the small game that is associated with these kind of edge environments. In the case of the Kalahari, as I've mentioned previously, we see a kind of border between the desert and the northern tropical savanna of the region. And again, these are climactic subregions, which still have very long periods of winter drought, punctuated by very wet summer periods. As is the case with our Inuit example in the Arctic tundra, people that live within the Kalahari Desert and similar climate regions or climactic regions generally and historically have been foragers or hunters and gatherers. Of course, this has changed over time, but some of these traditions have remained. As a result, their diets are very diverse. The energy intake for communities living within the Kalahari region have very wide expressions of plant types. A typical Kalahari community will incorporate well over 500 species of plant in their annual diet. Correspondingly, we will see a taxonomic diversity in terms of the species of animal that will also be incorporated into their diet. Again, looking across the kind of breadth of the research that has been done over the years by biogeographers on this region, we see an average of over 50 species of animal that are incorporated into the Kalahari Desert diet. So, for example, again, focusing on this very diverse diet, we will see populations gathering wild nuts from mongongo trees and supplementing their local seasonal gatherings of berries, melons, roots, tubers, and honey with these famine foods. Men often will participate within local hunting traditions. They will add things like warthog, tortoise, rock python, ostrich eggs, and other very unique forms of local animals to the diet as well. Even giraffe is hunted periodically. So a much more diverse diet, yet a very similar form of subsistence strategy when we compare historical peoples of the Kalahari region to peoples of the Arctic Circle. So too we will see a difference in technologies. When we look historically at the Kalahari region, we realize that tools of peoples, both men and women, living in this environment consist of locally produced digging sticks and even a bow and arrow kind of technology type. Metal implements and firearms have been added to this since the late 1950s, and their settlement patterns have changed quite a bit as a result of the introduction of new technologies. One of the things that we see, and we saw this also with populations among our Inuit speakers, is that they will start to live in larger groups. They do not need as much land to be able to support higher populations as a result of these new technologies. Correspondingly, as well, we have seen an increase in the impact of wage labor in the region, and we have even seen until probably the last 10 years a pretty well established poaching economy, and that has also impacted how people live in the region. A specific example of a language family that is associated with the Kalahari region is the Juchwasi people of this environment. Until the warfare of the 1980s, and warfare has been associated with local nationalities and ethnic groups and their conflicts. The Jutwasi, like the Kung, another important language family, they've been very mobile, following seasonal weather patterns, especially the rain patterns, and then, of course, following food resource patterns of resource availability. Unfortunately, the conflicts between ethnic groups in the region have forced many communities to be less mobile, and it has caused problems with regard to their diets and has resulted in some small scale famines in the area. So, too, over time, and we see this especially in the 1990s, there has been an increasing push towards sedentary or non mobile agriculturalism. And the raising of cereal crops in the area. This has not taken well just because of the soil types and the amount of soil erosion, which characterizes the fragile soil types in the area. Prior to the introduction of, in this case, local conflict, and then, of course, agriculture. As I said previously, population sizes were small, generally organized around extended family relationships and marriage alliances. Today, this has expanded greatly. We start to see the presence of even village and town life. Diets have also changed. Studies by anthropologists and biogeographers in the 1960s took a closer look at how people on a community wide level were meeting or exceeding their daily subsistence needs. They were also taking a look at the impact that not only strife within these regions was having on populations, but the introduction of new modern food traditions and food technologies. In this analytic process, researchers created a series of indices that counted food resource amounts in relation to the amount of labor time or daily time that was spent collecting, hunting, or gathering, or even raising some of these new domesticates that were being introduced. As part of this analytic process as well, resources were weighed as they were being brought to camps, and then they were analyzing how the resources, again, food resources generally, were being divided among the population of each of the camps that were part of these ongoing studies. Again, the idea of efficiency and balance became very, very important in terms of the conclusions and the findings of these studies that began in the 1960s. So the total amount of meat and vegetable foods that were acquired were then compared to the total number of hours that community members spent in acquiring and preparing them. Looking in a sense at a kind of energy budget for each of the populations within the study environment. And again, this physically the study environment was this kind of subclimate region. So what were some of the findings in terms of the results? Gathering, in this case for historic groups, was 2 to 3 times as productive as what we have seen in other environments. Gathering was also, and the resources that were being gathered, principally vegetable in nature, made up the core of the Kalahari diet. When looking at gender and labor, some of the conclusions included that 1 man-hour of hunting brought approximately 800 calories to a community's diet on a weekly basis, whereas 1 hour of a woman hunting or gathering brought nearly 2,000 calories. So, and again, I mentioned weekly, this was on a daily basis, my apologies. But you can see here that, again, gender and labor do have a strong relationship within the region. And when we look at what particular group is contributing more to the diet, we see that women are, and these gathered resources become a very important part of survival in the region. They also found is that many of these gathered resources, and again, most of them were vegetable in nature, were resources that were specifically drought resistant. So in terms of the diet that people had, and those particular species of plant in this case that were very important to that dietary design, drought resistant plants were making up at least 50% of the vegetable aspect of the diet. Mungungo nuts, again, would be a very good example for that. The average daily consumption of these drought resistant forms added up to about a little over 1,200 calories. They also provided nearly 60 grams of protein to the diet. So, both being drought resistant, more resilient in a sense, and being a major resource for both protein and calorie intake, made the decisions, the food-based decisions that people would make, extremely important. It was found that generally an average person within the Kalahari region on a daily basis would eat about 9 ounces of meat. This was again something that was somewhat deficient in relation to the vegetable diet, but and it was also something that was a little more seasonal. But there were cultural adaptations that helped to, in a sense, negotiate some of those deficiencies. All in all, in terms of combined resources, providing daily caloric intake, protein was pretty high when we compare Kalahari populations to other groups, both agricultural, hunting and gathering, horticultural, even industrial. In fact, when you compare these diets to our own, we see that they will, in a sense, extend beyond us by at least 30% in terms of daily protein intake. So it's a very protein-rich diet. And we find this in many of these very extreme climate and climatic regions. Last but not least, we'll take a look at agriculture as an adaptation to specific climates and climatic subregions. Now, determining productive and consumptive ecological trends becomes difficult when one begins to study the historic and modern uses of domesticated plants and animals. So we focus more intensely when we're trying to understand how agriculture works or behaves as another one of these subsistence strategies on smaller scale and less industrialized forms of agriculture. Um, when we incorporate the industrial approaches taken in countries such as the United States, the job is very, very difficult, as you can imagine. So too, with intense forms of agricultural production, we're also looking at something that is a global phenomenon, where you have, in this case, resources, both plant and animal, that are being produced on a very large scale, being then shipped into or moved into a variety of external markets. And that's something that kind of gets away from our primary thesis, which is to look at how culture, and how specifically culture focusing on food production, how it behaves within a local environment. The majority of agricultural production on the planet today fits within a kind of microthermal subclimatic region. And one area within the United States, for example, which is a good example for a microthermal climate type, would be the northern portions of the Midwest. This would include not only the kind of central and southern half of Wisconsin, of course, stretching across to places like central and southern Minnesota, but then also it moves down into Illinois. We find it in Iowa. We find it even in Kansas and Missouri. Prior to the global intensification of agricultural production following the Second World War, places like the Midwest or the Central Plains states of the United States would produce, in this case, a pretty significant amount of food, and that food would stay local. In this case, it would be consumed on a national level as opposed to an international level. But averages that we see in the 1950s and 1960s places us at approximately 4,000 kilocalories of food produced on a daily basis by each agricultural worker. And that is significantly higher than anything else we see historically when it comes to modes of subsistence. What this does for us in terms of our demographics is it allows us to live in more concentrated populations. It also allows us to live in much larger populations as well. If we are to compare even on a regional scale, the kind of production, agricultural production that's occurring in the United States in the 1950s and 60s to what we have in terms of agricultural workers in places like Burundi in Central Africa or Zaire or Tanzania, we see that in this case, agricultural workers on a daily basis would produce about 40 kilocalories. So there is a real difference there between um, region to region agricultural practice. And of course, when we're dealing with more intensive agricultural practices in the United States and in Central Europe, there's a real disparity. So it becomes a very challenging process as we are trying to understand how agriculture behaves, and we have to start to categorize it and classify it in a variety of ways that allows us to look at specific regions and focus more on those smaller scale practices. So let's take a look at one small scale agricultural example, in this case agriculture that is part of a corporate process, and again a corporate more in the sense of smaller producers who are creating their own kinds of consortiums to be able to interact with larger market environments. So it's not corporate in the sense of IBM or Apple. This is corporate in the sense of social corporations. And in this case, we're looking at Mexican family farms and how they are organizing labor and, of course, how they are bringing together their production processes in places like northwestern Mexico. In these Hispanic cooperatives, we see a real emphasis on labor. We see a much more significant role that labor plays in the production process than in either of our previous examples and everything in between. If we are to take a look at the modern Opata Indians and how they are part of this process, what we realize is that we have a variety of factors or variables that are at work here. We have crops that are indigenous to the region that are being actively domesticated and produced, and we have situations where those more rural, more local domesticates are then being manufactured in a way that is introducing them to a world marketplace. We have that along with global cash crops, things like corn, for example, that are being then grown side by side with those more traditional crops. And so there's a lot of things going on. So too, in many of the labor practices in these small-scale agricultural settings, we have, again, the role of the family being very, very important in terms of organizing labor and some of the expectations for men and women in terms of the labor market, the number of hours that people are working, the expectations of those laborers, things like that. Given all of this, one of the other things that we see is that like our other subsistence strategies, hunting and gathering or foraging, horticulturalism, pastoralism, all these different smaller scale practices, individuals who are part of these small scale, culturally rooted and localized practices are very much at risk with regard to the production process. They can be at risk in terms of environmental hazards, landslides, floods, things like this, droughts. But then also we see environmental hazards with regard to, or hazards rather, with regard to changing markets, changing global tastes, and then of course competition from larger scale, more intensive agricultural producers. So let's take a look for a moment at some of our measurements and see how this human ecosystem works in terms of the small scale agricultural example. So there are two measurements that we really need to consider. First, what has been achieved through energy expenditure with the introduction of technologies and domesticates, and then what energy has been expended to achieve that. Right, so we have to incorporate some of the more mechanized processes and some of the even seed technologies into our understanding mathematically of how a human ecosystem, such as a small scale agricultural tradition, functions. We also have to mathematically consider the systematic input of non-human animal labor and some of, as I said before, more automated productive processes. So for example, human beings really only represent less than a single horsepower of energy that is put into a daily agricultural practice. Um, we see a much higher amount of input in beasts of burden. So two oxen who are part of, let's say, a terrace farming or a wet rice farming tradition in Southeast Asia would be reaching close to 2 horsepower of energy that is being infused into the production process. This increases um, in a rather extensive manner when we start to incorporate small gas-driven tractors, about 6 horsepower there, for example, on average, or even larger tractors, 50 or more horsepower. So we really have to understand something about the technologies that are being used and applied in these local agricultural environments. So when we look more closely at the Hispanic cooperatives associated with the Opata traditions, indigenous traditions of places like Mexico and Mesoamerica, we find that on average, an Opata ethnic cooperative will incorporate over 22,000 small-scale farm environments. These cooperative farms will represent in a sense, local communities coming together and incorporating all of their resources in the production process. In terms of climate, generally we find these ethnic corporations being situated in low and warm or hot, um, low latitude steppe environments, especially in the northern hemisphere. In many of these environments, things like corn and squash are primary cash crops that are grown and, of course, sold. We also see the introduction of things like, and it's not really an introduction anymore, but we see the presence of coffee also as a kind of cash crop. And again, these sit side by side with local indigenous, usually eaten foods as well. The corn, the squash, the coffee, these are sold on a global scale, but again, it's through a network process, and many of these corporate um, ethnic corporations rather are designed in such a way as to get the products out into these global environments. Areas are tilled by communities. They will have a sense of territory, a sense of land and land ownership that they will use. They will have a variety of practices to increase the production of soils in the area. And they can reach, in this case, sizes of around a few hundred acres. And we will see a combination of technologies used in terms of tilling the land. We will see very small scale automated kinds of tractor-based practices, but then we'll still see the contributions of both human and animal labor. We will also see alongside these larger tracts of land, small family garden plots that will be contributing more to household subsistence than community economies. But as I said earlier, when we compare agricultural production to other forms, even smaller scale forms, including our foraging example, we are seeing a lot more of a labor investment. So in the case of an ethnic corporation, we see over 1,000 hours of individual human labor that is incorporated into the production process on an annual basis. And we see, in this case, over 200 hours of animal power that is incorporated into a a month-to-month kind of model for this form of production. So when you're taking a look at climate and climate types, one of the things that you have to do is you have to think more broadly. You have to think about how the plants and animals within these environments are well adapted to the long-term patterns of weather, patterns of both temperature, precipitation, and everything in between. You also have to consider, with regard to human beings, how we have incorporated landscapes and both the natural and cultural qualities of those landscapes into our ability to survive over long periods of time. So human ecology becomes an important part of how we are slowly kind of working our way across the planet, looking at the natural systems of the planet, the geochemistry of the planet, the geophysics of local landscapes, the locations of specific landscapes. It all becomes very much tied to how humans have been able to migrate into these environments and then thrive within them as well. And their culture is a big part of that success story.